Hello everyone, it's finally that time. Welcome back to another album review. In this video, I'm going to review Fear Inoculum by Tool. Where do I even begin with Tool? This is possibly my most hyped album ever. I was expecting this thing for a very long time. I was really looking forward to when it's going to be the day where we're going to have a new Tool album. It's been 13 years since the release of their last album 10,000 Days back in 2006. Throughout all of these 13 years, Tool would constantly tease the album coming out, and then it would come the one troll after the next. There would be a lot of other circumstances that could bring Tool into the position where they wouldn't feel like making the album, since they might feel that it was not the right time, and that's totally understandable. But there was a point where all of this hype would drag out and fade away, which is something that actually happened with me. At the end of the day, there were so many times where I was telling myself that we probably do not need another Tool album, because I had this worry that they would release something that would possibly ruin what is possibly my favorite set of discography. Yes, we're talking about a small discography. It just contains 4 albums if you count out Opiate, and all of these 4 albums are some of the most spectacular music experiences I've ever had in my life, with all 4 of them being respectively, for their own reasons, some of my favorite albums of all time. I pretty much love everything Tool have released. Yeah, I might sound a bit biased over here, but it's true that Tool back in my teenage years offered a musical experience that was extremely unique for me, and it really moved me forward into appreciating more styles of music. Their music kept me company into some struggling situations I would have, and there was a small period of time where I would just play Tool non-stop. I discovered them back when I was in middle school, like 13 or 14. So for me, yeah, it's not 13 years of waiting for this new album to come out, but it was still a pretty long period of time. And the hype for a release of a new Tool album became a big meme in the music community, where everyone would just be like waiting for the new album and like having a huge hype for the whole album. And after a while there would be a period where I would just be drawn out by the sound of Tool, because I've heard their albums so many times. Still up until this day, it's sort of hard for me to believe that we're at this day, we're at the day where we have a brand new Tool album. It's still hard for me to believe it. And not only that, but also I knew that I had to sit through this album lots of times in order to just grasp anything that is going on with this album and everything that they have done with their structure, with an instrumentation, because the sound of Tool is hard to grasp at first listen. This is definitely something that hasn't happened with me. Tool is one of the most prime examples, possibly the most prime example of the band that just needed multiple listens through each one of their albums in order to get to this point where I would think that every single of their works is actually a masterpiece. Believe it or not, back when I was 13 or 14, when I listened to Tool for the first time, I didn't like their albums. I thought Lateralus, for example, was an extremely boring album, and the whole way they would just play with their instruments, having all of those odd time signatures, for me it was like something quite pretentious, and back in the day I couldn't get it. But there was still something that made me keep coming back to those albums, and every time I would listen to the album I would just discover a new thing every single time. Even up until this day, when I've heard the albums hundreds of times, I still discover new things. That's the magic with the sound of Tool. And I think that the first point where I got actually intrigued by the sound of Tool was with the album Penuma with the interlude parts. Being a guy who from back in the day would love those weird electronic stuff, those sounds from Penuma with all of those interludes would just sound mind-blowing to me. A new era of music just lit up on my eyes, and after this point I just listened to every single one of the albums from Tool again and again and again and again, and every single time I would hear them, the more I would fall in love with them. And now we're to this point where Tool is my favorite band of all time. Sure, right now I might sound like a hugely pretentious fan that thinks that Tool is the best thing to ever come out, and if you don't like Tool then you don't know about real music, which is not the case for me at all. I'm not that type of a Tool fan. There was though a very small period of time where I was that mind blown by the sound of Tool, where I would be just, oh, you don't know about real music, you're an actual pleb if you don't appreciate the sound of Tool. Yeah, it's unfortunate. There were some of these moments back when I was like 14, but now that's not the case whatsoever. And to be honest with you, I didn't really know and I wasn't expecting that Tool would get so much of a hate for being called such a pretentious band and having such a pretentious fan base. It was up until recently when I got in touch with music communities on the internet. But of course that doesn't hold me back for forming my own opinion and just think that everything Tool have done so far it's just perfect. And that of course would not mean that Fear Inoculum is automatically a perfect album. If this album really has issues or stuff that I don't like from it, I will gladly address them. I'm not the type of guy that I would say that this album is just awesome just because we're talking about Tool. This is not the case. We have this new release over here, finally, after 13 years. So, what I can say about Fear Inoculum is that some of my fears that I had for all of those years actually came a bit true. In my opinion, what we have over here is my least favorite Tool album. This is the worst Tool album. Now, of course, that doesn't necessarily mean that since this is my least favorite album from Tool, that doesn't mean that the album sucks or that it's bad. Instead, what we get with this album is actually quite impressive and spectacular once again. This is an amazing album from Tool. I really love this album, but is it able to be on par with the incredible 4 albums that they have done in the past? No, not even close, and that's a bit of an unfortunate thing. Because with each album, Tool would just have a new, unique and refreshing way of just creating tracks, having all of those weird structures, and just having all of those mesmerizing experiences that you couldn't find in any other band. Throughout all of those years, I haven't found a band that managed to grab the same aesthetic or the sound of Tool. There are definitely some of the prog metal bands and the alternative metal bands that make an attempt, but with each album, Tool would just feel like reinventing the wheel constantly. And that is not the case with Fear Inoculum. Instead, what we get with this album is some ideas that feel really identical with anything Tool have released up until this point, which was something that was a bit of my worry when I heard the teaser track, the self-titled one, Fear Inoculum. A track that, don't get me wrong, it's incredible. The more I listen to it, the more I just discover so many great things about it. I've heard this track a lot of times, and there are so many things to love about this track. First of all, I think once again what they do with the production is amazing. Tool offer a great sounding experience. It's really clean and everything just sounds so good and pristine. Then once again we have excellent, flawless performances. It feels like the band hasn't aged not a single day and they perform the same way. The chemistry of this band is mind-blowing up until this day. The vocals from Maynard, they're more calm, they're more chill, but they're quite spectacular once again, and all of the elements with the drumming, with the guitars, the bass, they're incredible. However, the issue with the track is that right from the first time I've heard it, this one sounded a lot like other stuff I heard from Tool in the past. There was a huge deja vu with this track. Like, there were moments with the drums that sounds so much like the percussion that was used on the song Reflection back from the album Lateralus. These are things that Tool have presented before. I was at least hoping that the rest of the album was going to offer something more unique and something more compelling, something that wouldn't necessarily sound so much like anything else Tool have done before. Unfortunately, that's a bit of the case. Pretty much the album doesn't reinvent the wheel. It doesn't offer something new for the standards and the sound of Tool, which is not necessarily a bad thing for itself. I don't mind that the band is playing it safe, but we're talking about a band that has released 4 albums that each one of them would constantly just bring something different, bring something more unique to the table, and Tool are known as one of those bands that would constantly bring something new, something unique. So I was at least hoping that when it comes to an album that took 13 years to complete, I was expecting that we're going to get something more than that, because we're talking about Tool. My expectations for a band that has such a solid discography as this should be quite high. I had high hopes for this album, and the ending result is a bit disappointing, but not in the way where it ruins the experience. Just like I said, it's definitely the weakest album in the Tool discography. One of the things that I extremely enjoyed though is that I pretty much got the same experience just like listening to the other Tool albums, where I didn't have to just hear this for one time and just form an opinion. Instead, when I heard this album for the first time, I was just really confused and I was like, okay, I have to listen to this again and again and again and again, which is something that definitely happens with albums. Opinions change, but there has never been a point where I would be that immersed and getting into an album that many times as it happens. And I pretty much got the same experience with this one as well. I needed to listen to this a lot of times, and each time I would just discover something different. I would just find more things to like and appreciate, and I'm pretty sure I'm still to a place where I haven't entirely grasped anything that is going on with this album. Instead, by the time of this review, when the year is going to end, I might appreciate the album even more and find more things to it that I'm going to like. For example, back when I first heard the album for the first time, the second track, Penuma, happened to be my least favorite song, because I thought that this track in particular just sounded a lot like anything that I've heard from Tool so far, which yeah, it is the case. There are some deja vu moments on the track Penuma. For example, the guitar tone where the main riff plays just sounds so much like the riff from Vicarious. However, the more and the more I listen to this track, I just discovered that this track is so incredible for what it does. And after an amazing chorus, in my opinion, Tool deliver one of the best riffs they've ever written. Right halfway through the song, there is an incredible part with tribal percussion, smooth bass lines, and an incredible synth, and the melody keeps progressing, getting harder and harder, and it leads up to an incredible finisher. The best finisher out of the album, in my opinion, it's on this track, Penuma. And the impressive part is how smooth it goes through its timeline, going for almost 12 minutes long, which is another thing that stays with this new Tool album, and it's quite fascinating once again. Tool will always have lengthy tracks, and what's the incredible thing about them is that Tool can make 10-minute tracks that don't feel like 10-minute tracks. They feel like far less than that, or they feel really smooth into their execution, and they're 10 minutes just passing by really enjoyable and without having a moment to them where they would sound tiring. And this is an incredible thing that pretty much happens with everything Tool have released so far, and fortunately this is not an exception with this album, which is also an album that has lots of massive tracks. This album contains the biggest and the lengthiest tracks out of every Tool album, and this is coming from a band that is used to have lots of lengthy tracks and lots of lengthy albums. But Fear Inoculum is actually the longest one, going for 79 minutes long with only 7 tracks, all of them going for more than 10 minutes long with the exception of Chocolate Chip Trip. And if you take the digital version, there are also 3 interludes, and then the album just goes for 86 minutes long, making this the longest Tool release from a band that is mostly known for making really lengthy albums. Though someone can argue that some of those tracks could drag a bit less, and that there are some moments where the structure feels kinda repetitive and they would just bring less by making something better. This is an album where you don't get short tracks going for something more straightforward. Some of their more well-known tracks actually go for 5 or 6 minutes long, like Schism, The Pot, Sober, Stinkfist. And with the occasions with tracks like Fear Inoculum and Penuma, it works really well. They're really smooth in their execution and they don't feel like they drag for something longer. The whole structure to it feels really spectacular. Though when it comes to tracks like Invincible and Dissenting, these are tracks that are quite nice. They have some great moments to it, but there are 2 of those tracks where I feel that as a full thing they don't manage to have something that compelling or something that fulfilling. They could definitely drag for something less. Instead, they have more of like individual amazing moments. For example, the track Invincible has an amazing moment towards the 6.5 minute portion where it has this amazing drums from Danny Carey, this amazing heavily reverbed snare, and the part combined beautifully with a great bass line to it that is really hard hitting. The chorus on this thing is also amazing, and it also offers some of my favorite lyrics from this album. The highlights on the track Dissenting are the more smooth parts to it. It starts and ends with some nature recordings, and most of the track contains a really smooth and nice guitar melody and some of the better vocals from Maynard James Keenan in the entire album. The parts where the track picks up also sound really good, but like with Invincible, it's also a track that doesn't really revolutionize anything. Instead, there is a moment on the track Dissenting where it has this low-pitched synth melody that is exactly the same from the track Reflection, and it's also put on a very small portion on the track Rosetta Stone. The 10-minute Culling voices is one of my favorite moments in the album. I like how smooth and how calm it is, and it has a huge introduction that goes for more than half of the track, but it's so smooth and it just drags really well without feeling any boring. The vocals from Maynard are extremely passionate and the guitar melodies are incredible, and what's really amazing is that the track picks up into actually having the heaviest riff out of the entire album and one of the heaviest moments you can hear in the album, and that gets into the most perfect mixing moment out of the entire album. Culling Voices is amazingly mixed. I love how it picks up from those really silent and smooth moments to some really heavy and loud guitars. And this unpredictability, this way of mixing, is also one of the reasons why I love some of the older albums from Tool, because they would constantly have moments like this, and it's presented on Culling voices in a perfect way. The track Chocolate Chip Trip is the only interlude over here, going for a bit less than 5 minutes long. And this is an extremely weird and intense track, and I love it. It's the interlude I wanted from the album. It's the one very refreshing moment of the album that just gives a break from this straightforward formula of really lengthy tracks. And the song starts with this really dark, eerie and ominous tribal sounds, then leading into a really weird and plucky analog synth melody. And then after a while, on top of this synth melody, Danny Carey gives his most intense performance in the album. He basically free improvises over this weirdly structured synth, and what he does with the drums is really mind-blowing. Danny Carey is one of my favorite drummers, and he has an amazing drum kit that gives this tribal aesthetic that is also presented on this track. But what he does in this particular moment is next level, and it might feel all over the place, but it's actually not. What he presents, what he plays, feels so on point, and it's incredible. His drumming is still amazing after all of these years, and I'm just astonished by this song. It's definitely one of my favorite moments in the album. I really love this song. Then the album ends with Tempest, which is the hardest moment on the album. Actually, on the first half, this track reminds me of something that Tool would play back in their very first album, Undertow. This track really does have the harshness and the intensity from back on those days, which is something really impressive. And Maynard's vocals are amazing. He still got it, because for the most of this album, he just goes into a more smooth direction. Instead, this album goes into a more smooth direction. This is definitely the most calm and the smoothest album in the entire Tool discography, and this is possibly the thing that makes it stand out from anything else they have released so far. With the concept of the album having to do about age and wisdom, all of those elements from the lyrical standpoint also seem to land in a weird way in this album when it comes to the music terms, as it sounds quite mature and having a more melancholic and atmospheric feel to it. This album does offer a chill experience. It's only with the last two tracks where it would get more intense. And Tempest has some great ideas to it, and instead there are some great solos on this thing that actually offer some of the most unique moments out of this album. Some of the most refreshing parts land on this track. However, this track going for 15 minutes long, it's actually one of the very few moments in a Tool song where I feel it goes a bit more than what I would want. It drags a bit more than what I would like. Like, the solos on this thing are incredibly large, and it's one of those songs that doesn't manage to just grab my attention from start to finish, having something really that fulfilling to it. But don't get me wrong, this is still a great track. There are some quite nice moments to it, and I get why for lots of people Tempest is their favorite song out of the album. It definitely has some elements that the rest of the album doesn't provide. For me though, it's my least favorite moment in the album, but it's still a quite nice track and a nice finisher to the album. Now, getting into the digital version on this thing, containing 3 interludes, 3 short tracks that go for 2 and 3 minutes long, I would say that in my opinion, these 3 interludes are actually my least favorite ones out of every Tool album. I think the interludes themselves are quite nice. I like the dark ambient and haunting tribal approach with the tracks Litany Contre Le Pure, and with Legion Inoculum. And Mocking Beat is a quite nice finisher containing tribal percussion and nature recording, and it makes for a quite chill finisher. But for a person who really loves the interludes out of every single Tool album, I think that they could have done something a bit better with these ones, since their sounds and the way they approach the structures of the songs leave a lot to be desired, and so it kinda makes sense why they're not included in the physical release, because they don't really add up anything to the album, and even in the places where they're placed in the track listing of the digital release, they don't feel like they come up as great or like there is a nice and smooth continuation in between those tracks, which is something that was a big deal with anything else Tool have done, since they would have these extremely nice bridges of getting from an interlude to a song. Though, like I said, in no way are they bad, and they don't ruin the overall experience on the album, and they're not included in the physical release, so it doesn't necessarily matter all that much. This video, I'm pretty sure that it's going to be a long one, so I'm just going to cut more filler and get straight to the point that this is an amazing album. Does it live up to the hype from the previous albums? Was it worth the wait of 13 years in order to get this? Kinda yes. I mean, the album itself is not bad. Sure, it might be my least favorite release from Tool, because it doesn't manage to capture the greatness of the previous 4 albums they have done, but without all those bias and just sticking with what they released and what they presented right here, this is an incredible album. This is album of the year material right there. The production, the structures, the chemistry, they're still there. They've still got it. Presenting their most chill, their most atmospheric and their most melancholic album so far. Being able to stand out for its own unique reasons in a great discography. I'm going to give Fear Inoculum an 8+ out of 10. What's your opinion on this album? Like it? Dislike it? Why? And what do you want me to review next time? Let me know down in the comments. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video, subscribe for more content like this. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Goodbye.